And we are here with Mike Keneally.
Howdy.
Howdy. Man, so where are you currently?
Right now in Oostende, Belgium.
And who are you with?
The Bizarre World of Frank Zappa.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Was it a bizarre world?
I guess in the sense that I've never been a part of anything like it. It's definitely unusual. It's unique. It's been wonderful. The show's been fantastic. If you don't know the what's happening with the tour, it's a bunch of guys that we haven't played Frank's music together in some cases in over 30 years. So it's amazing to be reconnected with these guys. It's just so much fun, and the visuals are just they're a blast. It's just a really fun night. It's kind of a controversial tour, but I'd say the vast majority of the people who are actually taking the shot and coming to check out the show is really enjoying it. So
yeah, I mean that's kind of what you're doing is it's innovative, and it's like I don't know, has this really been done? Not definitely not with this caliber and complexity of music.
No, yeah, I mean it's the combination of all the elements, musical and visual. It just creates something that I think has an energy that's pretty undeniable. And what's also fun about it is that we're just at the beginning of this trip with this concept. So I know they have a desire to keep this format going, from year to year, and it's the kind of format that, because it's based on individual songs that have been that have specific animation done for that song, scenarios for each song. It's kind of a modular format where we can refresh the playlist from year to year and even refresh the band. I could easily imagine having different guys come in and play, not necessarily guys, different people come in and play the music. It's a strong concept, and it's a very exciting thing to be a part of. We're having so much fun. It's crazy.
That's awesome. And if something happens to you, they can just have a hologram of you.
There's always that option. There's always that option. But I mean, it's something that we're probably going to have to deal with because I've got various other things on the table that are going to be keeping me occupied for the next couple of years. And and I don't expect the Zappa touring juggernaut to be completely adherent to my schedule. So I'm sure there's going to be some dates that I can't do, so that we'll be able to test the format and get somebody else in there to slide in, and it'll just have a different energy. And I think that's a plus. It's going to keep the thing fresh, and I don't know. I just think we're at the beginning of a journey that's going to be going for a long time. It's really fun.
Well, let's take this whole thing to the beginning of your journey, because I think a lot of people are curious about you as a player. Like, how'd you get started in this whole, music thing? Just like the early.
Yeah, I mean, the real start of it was when I was very young, and it was a thing that my parents recognized before I did, because they bought me a keyboard, an electric organ, for my 7th birthday. And I didn't know that I wanted to be a musician, but as soon as I saw this thing, that's when I knew that I wanted to be a musician. It was instantaneous. And then, I loved the Beatles. I was a Beatle freak when I was a kid. I still am. Mm-hmm. So naturally, I wanted a guitar as well. And so I got 4 years later, on my 11th birthday, I got my first guitar. And
what was the story with guitar? Like at what point were you starting to get into some, I guess, more intense kinds of music?
I guess it started to get really intense when I first heard Zappa, which is when I was 9. And
really?
But then I say that, but what initially attracted me about Zappa was more the absurd aspect and the comedy aspect. Mm-hmm. But then the more I got into him, the more I realized the depth of what was happening there musically. But concurrently with that, I was also, because organ was my first instrument, when I started hearing progressive rock in the early 70s, that really excited me. So when I was 9, 10 years old, I was really liking Keith Emerson. So Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Tarkus album might have been like a real kind of flashpoint for me in terms of getting into very intense, very intricate music. But I was also listening to heavy stuff. I loved, Black Sabbath and Hendrix and all that kind of stuff too. Alice Cooper. But the real love that I started with was the Beatles, and that's kind of what got me wanting to play guitar.
Yeah, it's for many of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There was just something magical there, and I wanted a piece of it. And I kind of thought when I saw the pictures of the Beatles holding those beautiful instruments, they just looked like some kind of talisman, It was something I wanted to be a part of.
Sure. So, okay, you're spending your high school years probably like just getting better. And what's like the turning point after that with music?
Well, I kind of stayed insular. I kind of stayed, like through my high school years, I was playing with my brother at home. He got into playing the guitar, and I was playing the guitar and continuing to play keyboards. We got a couple of reel-to-reel tape recorders, a 4-track and a 2-track, and we would record stuff on the 4-track. We'd mix it down to the 2-track, and that was kind of like our version of being in a garage band, and instead of like forming a band and trying to get gigs or you find a drummer or whatever, things that a lot of young musicians would do. We we kind of stayed in this little laboratory at home and made recordings. We were trying to do our versions of records that we loved. So we would do, we had songbooks for Santana and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. So we would do that stuff. But then we started figuring stuff out off the records, and we were recording Jeff Beck songs and Hendrix tunes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes and Zappa and just whatever we liked and wanted to try to dissect and figure out what made it tick. We would record our own version of it.
And where are you in the States at this time?
Like in San Diego, Southern California.
San Diego.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So you're from there.
Yeah. Well, I was born in Long Island, like a lot of other guitar players. It's funny, something about Long Island, but again, we like I graduated from high school, 17 years old, and I still wasn't really thinking about gigging at that point. I was into music. We did form a band, my brother and I, but we never played live. We rehearsed for a year, learning like all the most complex music you could learn, and then we did one gig and broke up. It was like okay, that was that portion of the research was completed, and then we got more involved in recording. I got in 1982. I graduated high school in '79, and then in 1982 we got an Oberheim DMX drum machine and a couple of synthesizers, and I had a really good bass guitar. And at that point, we got more serious about the recording, and I got more serious about writing. And so, before I really ever got serious about trying to get gigs, we were just like in this recording laboratory, and then that gradually sort of evolved into a writing laboratory for me. And I would just like write dozens of songs, and we would record them. And I was getting involved with drum programming and stuff like that. And then finally, in 1983, my brother and I looked at each other and said, we should try to make some money off of this. And we found a bass player and a drummer and started doing gigs in San Diego in bars, they're doing top 40 songs. Just because, there was no way to make money doing the kind of weird original music that I was writing, which is still pretty much the case. And we, and so we had several years of working the bar circuit in and around San Diego, doing cover tunes, and that was actually an education in its own way, because finally I was like, interacting with audiences, playing music, and and I realized how much you don't know, how much you don't learn from staying in your home working
That's
on
incredibly
music.
true.
Yeah.
And you're in your mid-20s at this point,
Yeah.
right?
By the time I didn't really start getting serious about gigging, I was like 21 or 22 actually. That's when I started. As soon as I was old enough to legally enter a bar, I was doing gigs, and then we were also doing shows at fraternities on near college campuses, and that's a good education just in terms of like trying to entertain a bunch of psychos.
Yeah, it's still the case.
Yeah, yeah. Just learning to deal with energetically with various things that can come up with an inebriated audience. Those are important lessons. But still staying very very sort of on the down low, very, not really attempting to break out of the scene or anything.
So what was the next shift? Like,
The next shift was calling Frank Zappa and asking for a job.
wait a second, you went from playing bar gigs with your brother to playing with Zappa?
Yeah,
That's quite
there
a
was no
lateral
intermediate
move.
step. There was no intermediate step. Yeah, it was
Are you kidding?
yeah,
That's crazy, man.
it was nuts. And it's weird that was the step. That was the one decision that that everything that's happened since is a result of, and it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't just chosen to make that phone call.
You're talking about cold calling, like you just called.
100%, because no one knew who I was.
Okay, so I just like a description of like that experience. So it was like, hello, Mr. Zappa.
Well, he had there was a hotline for his office. It was 818 Pumpkin, and you called. If you called during the day, you would get a human who worked in the office would answer the phone. If you called after the end of the workday, you'd get a recorded message. And so I recorded. I phoned up one day, and I heard on the message, the recorded message, that Frank was in rehearsal with a new band. And this was late 1987, and he had done several tours in the 80s, in the early 80s, 3 tours, and they all lost money. So after the third one in 1984, Frank claimed that he was never going to tour again. He was tired of going out, busting his hump and losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he said that's it, no more touring. But then, in late 87, he had a change of heart, and when I called 818 Pumpkin that night, I heard a message that said, for those of you who may have heard any rumors, they're true. Frank is is in rehearsal with a new band. And that was pretty much all it said. And my initial thought was that this was exciting, that I'd get to see another Zappa tour, because I was sad that he had said he was never going to tour again. And then I just got this feeling, this instinct, that I needed to be more ambitious about it. And at the very least, I needed to put in that little extra bit of effort and make an attempt, even though there was no logical reason why it should have worked. But I called up the office during work hours the next day, and I got this guy on the phone named Jerry Fialka, who was a hero to me because he believed me. And I told him that hi, my name's Mike. I play guitar, I play keyboards, I sing. I sing, and I'm familiar with everything that Frank has done. I can play many of Frank's songs on various instruments, and I'm I have.
You're the guy.
I'm here. Basically, I wasn't like saying Frank needs me.
Yeah.
I wasn't that presumptuous, but I was just saying, if Frank needs someone like me, someone who can play various instruments and has a wide knowledge of the repertoire, I'm over here. Just sort of like waving my hand. Hi, I'm over here. And then he said, okay, well, I'll pass this information on to Frank. And I figured, well, that's probably the end of that.
Right.
But then the next day I got a call back, and it was Frank. And he said, all my songs? I don't believe you. Get your ass up here and prove it. That's literally. And he told me a couple of things that he wanted me to work on, a couple of songs that were both really hard, one of which I had previously taught myself, and the other one I hadn't. And then the next day, I was in San Diego. The audition was up in LA. My brother drove me from San Diego to Los Angeles while I practiced guitar in the back seat the entire time.
Do you remember the car ride?
I remember it incredibly sharply because I was trying to play all 300 and however many Frank Zappa songs during the course of a 3-hour car ride, and driving myself nuts in the process. And my brother actually pulled off the road at one point to stop and turn around, look back at me, and say, "You're never going to be more ready than you are right this second." And
That's so. That's just like a hard truth that nobody seems to really internalize. It's like you're as good as you are today,
yeah.
and all of the preparation is in the past.
Yeah, my brother's a wise person, so he had an inherent understanding of that, and he managed to, like, with that simple sentence, make me understand it as well, and I relaxed at that point, and the audition went beautifully. It's like, Frank asked me to play the songs that he had told me on the phone that he wanted me to learn, which were Sinister Footwear and What's New in Baltimore, and I played them well enough to demonstrate that he could ask me to learn complicated stuff, and I would one day later have something ready to show him, meaning that a week from now it'll be that much better, and he just said, okay, well, let me just see what else you know, and just started naming songs to see if it was really true that I knew all this stuff. And it basically was. It was like, okay, well, if it's a song that I haven't played before, just give me a second, because basically all of Frank's music was just running on a loop nonstop in the back of my brain. I was such a huge fan, and
you knew it, yeah.
And I was primarily a self-taught musician. I had keyboard lessons when I was a kid, but I was self-taught on guitar. And I developed a good ear as a result. Like, if I've heard a song a few times, I could probably play it for you.
What sort of like jazz background do you have, like in terms of that?
Nothing academically. Like, I haven't had any jazz training. It's just what I've gleaned from listening. And so what I know about jazz is basically results from listening to a lot of Coltrane, a lot of Miles Davis, a lot of Thelonious Monk. Those are the sort of like the three main aspects of the jazz trinity for me. And when I was a teenager and I was heavily into prog rock, I found that there was there were parallels between prog and fusion. So I really loved Chick Corea and Return to Forever. I really loved John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So I think and that stuff at an earlier age, I got into that stuff, the jazz rock, before I got into jazz. I think I needed that as a gateway in a way. So I was more into Chick Corea and John McLaughlin, and then later on I got into Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk, and then from there further back, checking out Charlie Parker and stuff like that, and Charles Mingus, and just beginning to try to immerse myself in the vast history of jazz, which is I still, there's so much of it that I still barely dip my toe in. But
I mean, it's like that seems to be the pattern though of people past the 60s, just like kind of discovering it in reverse, because you gotta gotta start from where you're sonically connected, right?
Exactly.
Like the sound of the guitar,
the loud distorted guitars and mini Moogs, and then back away from there, and then that's, and I think maybe in the early 90s that's when they really started with the advent of back when people were still buying CDs. They were being really creative and just like there was like some new Miles Davis or John Coltrane thing coming out on CD constantly, and when now there's like so many Miles Davis box sets, but back then they were just kind of getting it off the ground, and they put out Miles Davis and the Plug Nickel, December 1965, and that I think might be for me just like the golden ideal of what a group of musicians who are listening very carefully to one another can be capable of, and I got very excited about trying to create that kind of magic spontaneously with a bunch of really talented and sympathetic, empathetic, closely listening musicians, guys who know how to musicians who know how to improvise together. So
what was your best, like I guess with that kind of vision of how music should be played in mind, what were some of your most successful lineups that you just felt like you were flying?
Oh, you mean like with my own groups? You mean?
With your own thing, like where
Um,
you're just like, that's it. This is like
yeah.
as
Well, I
good
mean,
as it gets.
I guess I'm fortunate in that I feel like, I mean, I probably first felt like I was getting there around 1992, 1993, after I put out my first solo record, which was Hat. And
Hmm.
then, that album was recorded with a bunch of different musicians, and so there wasn't like a core group that played all the way through on that stuff. But the sort of main kind of essence of that period was a trio that I had with Tos Panos on drums and Doug Lunn on bass. And
Hmm.
both of those guys, Doug unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago.
Mm.
He's not just a bass player, but like a source of music, a source of knowledge. And he was my connection to a lot of jazz because he was really, really well versed in it, not just as a player, but as a lover of music.
Hmm.
And Toss had an amazing thing where he brought a lot of rock energy. Like he could be, John Bonham in 1 second and then Tony Williams next. He had a real jazz flavor to his phrases and his tone, and just this kind of circular way that he approaches, almost like an Elvin Jones thing, more than
Hmm.
a straight ahead rock thing. And to improvise with those guys, like if you listen to the Hat album, there's a piece on there called "We're Rockin' All Night with the Tangy Flavor of Cheddar," and then there's that has a head and then a completely improvised middle section, and then a composed vamp for a drum solo, and then the out head.
Hmm.
And that was my first attempt at writing something close to sort of like a jazz tune.
Hmm.
Uh, but
Just
it's
leaving that amount of freedom and going
yeah,
into the studio
and
and nailing it down.
yeah, exactly. It was more of a almost like the middle section is more of a free jazz thing in the manner of Ornette Coleman or something, rather
Hmm.
than attempting to play over a tonal center,
Changes, right?
or even a tonal center, not even changes, but just like
Yeah.
it was entirely dependent upon the moment and upon listening to each other. And in fact, we did a couple of takes, and there's another song on that album that is just the entire improv from another take of Cheddar that I
Mm.
removed from the song and turned it into its own track, which I ended up calling "Backstage with Wilson Phillips." But if and in fact that's the track, it's like if you want to hear sort of a kind of a catalyzing moment for me, and I was just lucky that the tape was rolling, of just like true improvisation with three people who are listening very carefully to each other and just like riding the wave of music, just like
Yeah.
feeling very carefully where this
It's
thing is
funny.
supposed to go. That piece, Backstage with Wilson Phillips, is like the not just the first recorded example, but one of the first examples where I really felt that I was a part of it while it was happening. And
That's
then
so funny, Mike, because I had Gary Husband on this thing, and he was describing him playing with Alan, and the words you're using are identical, because Alan
oh,
always called that catching waves.
well, I mean, well,
Yeah.
then I feel like I'm not a fool because I talk about an authority on the subject.
Right,
Uh,
but that's what it feels like. Just people
yeah,
are putting
absolutely.
this thing out, and you're either with it or not.
Yeah, precisely. So, I mean, once I got the taste for it, then it was just about surrounding myself with people who liked going there as well. And I've had some lineups that were more inclined to be involved in music on an improvisational level, and then
Hmm.
other ones that were maybe stronger at just dealing with the hard and fast, the sharp lines of the arrangements. Uh,
Hmm.
and both of them are very important to what I do. It's like if for somebody to be in my band playing my stuff, it's really crucial that they not only be able to cut a composition, the aspects of a composition that I've composed, but they have to be ready for any changes that might come up. And in fact,
Hmm.
Bryan Beller, who's played bass in my band for
Sure.
25 years now or whatever. He was a little bit taken aback initially. The first time I had him on one of my gigs, it was because Doug Lund was unable to do a couple of shows that I had booked. So Bryan had just joined Dweezil Zappa's band that I was in, and at first I gave Bryan a hard time because he replaced my friend Scott Tunis, who I'm now once again on the road with, playing Frank Zappa music. But Scott and I were really tight back then. Well, we still are, but we kind of like we had an alliance, and so we were in Dweezil's band together. Dweezil and Scott had a difference of opinion, and Scott was out, and I was resentful of that fact. I missed Scott. So Bryan Beller showed up as a result of having gone to Berklee College of Music with Joe Travers, who was the drummer in the band at the time.
Sure.
I had gotten Joe Travers into the band, and then Joe got Bryan Beller into the band, and I was like,
You were vibey?
Well, I was not giving Bryan the time of day because I missed Scott. I was unhappy about the fact that Scott was gone, and Bryan was like trying to show his interest in what I was doing. He learned Hat. He got the Hat album, my first album, and he learned songs off of it.
Ooh, it's hard to stay resentful, huh?
Well, I mean, but I was a dick because during rehearsals he would literally play my music without saying anything. He would start playing one of my songs, and I would physically turn away from him. And then, finally, I realized, why am I acting this way? And after a few days of this, I turned toward him and I said, okay, let's play this. And it's Bryan Beller. He's fucking great,
Yeah.
So I booked a couple of gigs that Doug Lund couldn't do, and I asked Bryan if he would do the gigs, and he he jumped at it. And so it was Tos Panos, Bryan Beller, and I, as Beer for Dolphins, which is the name of my band. And so we had a rehearsal, and we just played through the arrangements of the songs basically as they were on the record, just as kind of like to hit the major touchstones of the arrangements, and he had it all nailed. And I'm like, okay, cool, we're good to go. And then we do the show, and what I guess I hadn't sufficiently warned Bryan of is the fact that when I get on stage, I take my arrangements and just explode them.
Right.
I don't care to play the songs the way they sound on the records. That's uninteresting to me.
Mm-hmm.
So we get up there, and I'm like extending sections, and we get to a solo section, and I at the point that Bryan thinks the solo is over, and he goes back into the verse 3 or whatever.
So he's thinking that the stuff on the record is form, and you're just like,
I'm still up in the stratosphere.
Yeah.
Bryan's going, wait for me, and so it's like, so that was like, I just picked him up and threw him in the deep end of the pool, and and afterwards he was like, what the fuck was that? And so I guess I should have said this. I should have mentioned this. For some reason, I thought he intrinsically understood. Yeah, when I get on stage, those arrangements barely count.
In his mind, he probably thought that this is like an elaborate scheme to get back at him for taking Scott's job. Just like the end scene of Whiplash.
Maybe he may have even actually said that at the time. I'm not sure. It's like, is this your twisted revenge? But he caught on. Gradually he caught on. And then now it's like he understands my world so well, and
sure.
he can cut anything that I ask of him in terms of a composed thing. And then when it gets into and then one of the things that I really love is not just like you play a composed part of the song, and then there's some kind of a solo section, and then you go back to Discipline Land. What I really enjoy is when you're in a band that knows a song well enough to play with it all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just like waiting to the middle part of the song to go nuts. You're the same way if you listen to 9 different versions of Miles Davis playing Stella.
Sure.
by Starlight.
Everything's getting twisted.
It's like it's recombinant DNA, and I like treating my songs the same way, and so. This is
essentially like in jazz, since like rhythmically the roles are defined, then like there's no real parts, like like a walking bass line or chords. It's like it's at your discretion. With rock, you gotta really be a kind of rock player
Well,
to
yeah,
be able to
because
do that.
I mean, and of course, if it's a riff based thing, then it's a riff, and especially if it's a riff that several people are supposed to be executing in unison, then you could be getting into some trouble once you start messing with that. Not that I don't occasionally like to get in that kind of trouble, but if it's a chordally based thing, then kind of the sky's the limit,
Well, yeah, because that's the thing about composition. It's like theoretically you should be a little wiser and better today than yesterday. So you shouldn't be that committed to yesterday's decisions.
Hell no. Yeah, it's true, and it's fun too. Then that's one of the interesting things about record making, of course, is because you have to commit when you're making an album, and you got no choice but to just say, okay, well, what feels right to me right now?
Yeah.
But then that just becomes a blueprint of what you're going to do with that song on stage later, as opposed to the a photograph that needs to be replicated time after time.
Sure. So let's get back a little bit into like the Zappa story. I'm sure people want to hear about that. So you're in the band. What's that look like?
Well, I mean, it all happened so dizzyingly quickly because I literally went from playing Huey Lewis songs in a bar in San Diego for an audience of 8 to being in Frank Zappa's band, and that was
not gradual.
Well, no, it was just hard cut. It was cinematic. It was like, and then 12 years later, except it was next week.
Thousands of people a show.
Yeah. Well, yeah, yeah. But before we even got to that, there was 4 months of rehearsal to get through. We rehearsed for 4 months, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, and that was my music school because I never went to music school.
You were with, who was it? The band, like it was like Chad Wackerman.
Chad, Scott Tunis, Robert Martin, Ed Mann, Ike Willis, Frank, and a 5-piece horn section: Bruce and Walt Fowler, Albert Wing, Kurt McGettrick, Paul Carmen. So it was a 12-piece band, and as I say, we rehearsed 40 hours a week for 4 months.
What does rehearsal look like?
Sounds
like Nazi boot camp.
Well, it was fun, and unlike Nazi boot camp.
In a fun way, I meant.
Yeah, but it was hard work, and what it looked like in concrete terms was Frank was usually busy. We rehearsed from 4 p.m. to midnight, 5 days a week. Frank was usually busy for the first 2 to 3 hours of rehearsal. Scott Tunis was deputized as the clone meister whenever Frank was not whenever Frank wasn't there. So the first several hours of rehearsal, Scott would lead us in that day's assignments, which were usually set by Frank at the end of the previous day's rehearsal. So Scott would lead us through whatever songs or passages from songs we needed to touch up on, and then Frank would come in and he would take over, and then for the last 5 hours or so of the day would be Frank leading us through all these songs, frequently dictating horn arrangements verbally on the spot, because we weren't just doing songs that had existing horn arrangements. We were doing a lot of songs from throughout his career, many of which had never been played with horns. So he had to fashion horn parts on the spot. He wasn't sitting at home, writing out charts nonstop. He was.
So was the process more a process of arranging or tightening up?
Arranging and then tightening up those arrangements.
Gotcha.
Let's say it was an older song, and one of the reasons I was glad that I was there is because I was like this connection to. I had this sort of a fan energy because I loved Frank's music so much, and I was like more obsessive about it than any of the guys in the band, including guys in the band who had been there for years.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a pretty wide knowledge of the repertoire. So I clearly remember one day Frank going, you know what, I think it would be cool to play Who Needs the Peace Corps. I haven't played that song for a long time. So he announced that, and then he just turned and looked at me and waited for me to start playing it. I was like, oh, okay, well, give me a sec. And I'd never played it before, but again, it's just one of the songs. My favorite Frank Zappa album is "We're Only in It for the Money," which that song is on. So it's just a question of going into the memory bank and finding the right module and plugging it in, like 2001 Space Odyssey style. And
Sure.
and then the song came out, and basically from my recalled knowledge of the arrangement, Frank created a horn arrangement on the spot. Like I played the chord progressions and stuff, and the little interstitial melodies, and then he would just tell one guy in the horn section, okay, you play this, and then everybody in a horn section kind of knows where in the stack they reside. So if Frank just told one guy what to play and what the chord was, then
so quickly they would come up with it.
Yeah, and so
voice leading, yeah.
Frank was dictating horn parts, and the guys were writing out their charts. So Frank would tell them what to play, they would write it down, and after a couple of hours, there's a horn arrangement for that song, and that process was repeated for the many songs that we played. Gradually, I think we ended up with a working repertoire of almost 120 songs in that band, which is what happens when you rehearse for 4 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's gotta.
And that's because that's just indicative of the size of Frank's catalog, but it's also because Frank really was aware of the fact that a lot of people come to his shows and want to see multiple shows, and he wants to blow their mind every night. Especially that tour, because we weren't just doing one-night stands in towns. We were actually playing 2 or 3 nights in most of the cities that we were playing in the U.S. And
so it would have been completely a different show.
There would be some touchdowns. Like this was 1988. It was in the midst of the hotly contested election year, and Frank had almost all the new material on that tour was very politically oriented. So he wanted that to be a cornerstone of the show, and especially because in the United States we were doing shows that had intermissions, and he would usually get involved with the League of Women Voters to have a table in the lobby where people in the audience could register to vote. So well, it wasn't exactly nonpartisan, because we would do a bunch of material in the first set that would totally shred Republicans, and then he said, "Now go out and register to vote." But Bush still won that election. But
in spite of your efforts.
But he did get thousands of very young first-time voters registered, and that was, to my knowledge, the first time a rock artist did that on tour, and I don't know whether that's still a practice, but I know that at the time a lot of other rock performers were inspired by Frank's example there, and I know that there were other tours that started registering people to vote. So that was cool.
When you were touring with him, I'm guessing that's like a little bit past his wild days in terms of like tour life.
Yeah, I mean, this was his last tour. It was the last tour that he did. He was in his late 40s, which now sounds incredibly young to me. But at the
That's
time,
like, this man's a dinosaur.
Yeah, exactly.
How is he still walking?
I know. 47. God. Yeah, well, I mean, I was 26 at the time, so it did seem much older. But yeah, I mean, he had certainly mellowed in certain aspects, and from his 70s touring peak.
Yeah.
But more than just age, the sad aspect of it is that he was already ill, and he knew that he was feeling poorly, but it hadn't been diagnosed. So the whole time that we were in rehearsal, the whole time we were on the road, he was developing prostate cancer, and I believe that he had been tested, and for whatever reason, just not diagnosed properly. Yeah, I mean, by the time he was diagnosed with it in 1990, he said from the way it's developed, it looks like you've had it for about 8 years. So that means potentially 3 tours that he did before he realized it. And of course that's going to affect your energy level.
Of course.
So he was not raging on the road.
Yeah.
But,
were you?
No, and in fact, I was pretty straight edge in a way. I was not, I would have some beers, but I wasn't doing any drugs at that time, and I wasn't interested in messing around on the road because I was very devoted to my wife. And in fact, when we did the European leg of the tour, she came out on the road with me.
Nice.
Although she was not, for insurance reasons, not allowed to travel on the bus with us. So she sort of she went on her own tour. She figured out Eurorail, and she just met us everywhere. So she had her own European adventure while we had ours.
That's awesome. A tour of classic Europe.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was really memorable. It was cool. So I didn't have any kind of a Motley Crue experience out on the road, but I had a very wonderful touring experience, but it was tempered by the fact that there were so many tensions within the band, and unfortunately it just kind of ground the band to a halt by the time, in fact, before the end of the European leg of the tour, Frank just became so wearied by the arguments and the squabbling within the band that he just kind of gave up. Like normally we would do 2-hour sound checks where we would rehearse new stuff. He might even write stuff. We were using the road and the sound check as a laboratory to not just rehearse stuff but develop new things. But by the end of Europe, especially when we got to the Italian portion of the tour, Frank just lost any desire to try to buck the trend that was happening in the band. It was just bad.
Was it personal or
it was personal? It was personal, but it was musical as well. Like there was certain members of the band that were not happy with the way things were happening musically and personally, and they attempted to coerce Frank into firing a guy, in order to keep the peace. And Frank was never going to respond well to that. He was never going to he's like, I like this guy. I like the way he plays. I have him in the band for a reason. Fuck you guys if you think you can change my mind about that. And he canceled a further 10 weeks of dates that we were going to do to finish out the U.S. because we basically only played the East Coast and some of the Midwest in America. We didn't do the South. We didn't do the West Coast, Pacific Northwest, any of that. So unfortunately, all that chunk of the U.S. missed out on that band, as well as any of the rest of the world.
In retrospect, these people probably feel a little weird about it. Well, like, you played too loud. Slowed down. Are you there, Mike? Mike? Hello? Mike? Oh no.
Literally within 2 weeks of that band stopping, he started getting calls, from guys saying, "Oh, we might have been hasty," and then when the album started to come out, because he released a lot of music from that tour, then he would get calls from guys in the band saying, "Wow, you know what? That band sounds really good. It's a lot better than I thought. Man, we should do that some more." And Frank was like, "Too little, too late," especially since he'd been diagnosed at that point, and at that point, it's just like any further touring was out of the question.
Yeah.
So that was heartbreaking on a variety of levels, but it's also, even though what we're doing now with the hologram tour it can in no way be a replacement for what the reality of touring with Frank was. It is really gratifying to reconnect with these guys and to be able to play Frank's music with them again. It does feel like not closure, but it feels like something that was unresolved has now been resolved, and it's a pleasure.
Were you finding yourself being nostalgic for that time, like later on in your career?
Well, I mean, not nostalgic exactly, maybe like wistful because it was that was all I wanted to do when I was growing up was play with Frank Zappa. So
Yeah.
to start my career there, it was disorienting in a way. It's like
Yeah.
most people have to try harder for their dreams to come true. I literally started my professional career with my absolute number one goal,
That's
and then
so insane.
suddenly it was over, and then I had to figure out what do I do now,
It's
and
like a
that
stockbroker buying like, $10,000 of Microsoft. Like they
pretty
want
much,
that. I guess I'll
yeah,
try something.
yeah, exactly. I said, I've got this little chunk of money. Let's see what happens, and then next thing you know. So it really did feel that way, and so there was a period of disorientation afterward. Well, first it was just sadness that I didn't get to play with Frank anymore, and so I wanted to just like be with him. So I would go to his house and just like hang out without being a nuisance,
Hmm.
while he was working on albums of music from our tour, but also various archival releases or synclavier
Hmm.
music he was working on. Uh, and part of his process when he was creating albums was to, I'm sure you're familiar with this phenomenon of like listening through other people, because
Oh yeah.
it's very important to witness somebody else's energy while they hear your music. If you're working on a composition, it's one thing if you're sitting there with headphones on. It's another thing when you're like uh, watching somebody else listen to it and then getting their instantaneous feedback. Or in the case of Frank, he would never say, "What do you think?" But he was a very
He'd read your body language.
yeah, he was a very you know qualified student of human nature. So
Yeah.
he would learn all he would need to know just from watching somebody. Like there was one piece that was released many years later on an album called Dance Me This, and it was called Piano, and all it is a programmed piano performance without any other orchestration, and it's entirely abstract, and the version that's on the album I think is an upgraded piano sample from the one that I heard. Like he played me a version where the piano sound was not that authentic, so it sounded pretty synthetic, and there was just all it is just like tumbling waterfalls of notes and nothing to that was easy for me to kind of grasp. So I'm just sitting there trying to find a toehold in this thing, and then he gets up and he turns it off, and I wasn't like saying anything. I was just sitting there concentrating, and he gets off and he turns it off and he goes, "Well, I'm not trying to torture you here." And I was like, no, no, no.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah. It's like, no, no, I don't dislike it. I'm just trying to figure it out. It's just like I'm just trying to. It's a very, very demanding piece. So,
Sure.
but so that was me just like rejoicing in the absolute ultimate fantasy of it's like I'm gonna go over to Frank Zappa's house and check out what he's working on, and then we would sit in the basement for hours and he would play music for me, just the two of us. And so that is as memorable an experience. Like right now, I feel more nostalgic for that than I do playing the stuff live. It's just because
Yeah.
that's
Well,
such that was such an exclusive kind of experience.
sure. Sure. It's a very human experience, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I actually had a relationship with the man.
Yeah, and then just like little things that would be so funny. Like one time, we wouldn't just listen to music. We'd hang out a bit. We'd eat. We'd watch TV. And there was one time when Dweezil was on the Arsenio Hall show. I don't know if you remember Arsenio
Yeah,
Hall.
of course.
Uh, he was a special kind of interviewer where you sometimes would get the impression that he wasn't listening very carefully to the person that he was interviewing. And so Billy D. Williams was a guest on the show when Dweezil was on, and we were watching Arsenio interviewing Billy D. Williams, and Billy D. Williams is relating some story from his life, and he was going, "Yeah, I was about 14 years old, and I did this happened or something like that, and yeah, I was 14, and that's when I met this guy. It's like, and that was an amazing thing to happen to a 14-year-old. It was incredible." And Arsenio's like looking at him real carefully, he's going, "Yeah, yeah." how old were you when that happened? And and so Frank, most people when they heard that, they would just like laugh or something. Frank's response to that was to go, oh, oh, and he like slowly got up, like he was carrying the weight of his world, the weight of the world. He goes, oh. And he got up, he goes, I'm 1,000,000 years old. that was, which I thought was an incredibly creative way to just describe the feeling that you might have from witnessing this exchange between Arsenio Hall and Billy Dee Williams. It made him instantly age 1,000,000 years and make it impossible to move. So it's just like, so that was
unbelievable.
Yeah, and then he just like slowly walked out of the room while I fucking laughed my ass off. It was great. It was great.
That's amazing, Mike. So what was next for you? Like you finished with Zappa.
I mean, I couldn't finish with Zappa in the macrocosmic sense because I was not ready to. That experience was cruelly foreshortened. Okay, so I was like,
sure.
So not only was I going and hanging out in the house, I ended up joining Dweezil's band, and I was in that band from '91 to '96. So
Dweezil was playing Zappa repertoire at that time. No, okay.
I mean, in the sense that he is a Zappa, he was playing Zappa repertoire. He was playing Dweezil
Frank Zappa,
music.
I meant.
Yeah. Just, we had a band called originally it was just the Dweezil Zappa band, and then it was called Z, and Amit was the lead singer. So it was Dweezil, Amit, me, Scott Tunis, and Josh Freese on drums. That was the first iteration. Then Josh left the band, and we got in Joe Travers, who I had met when Z was on the road. We played at. We did an in-store at a Tower Records in Boston, and Joe Travers was working at this Tower Records, and he gave me a VHS tape of him playing Frank Zappa music, and a photograph and a little cover letter, and he said that he really loved Dweezil's band and he wanted a shot. I stayed in touch with him, and he eventually moved to Los Angeles. Even before there was any chance of him being in Dweezil's band, just because he had this connection. He wanted to get out of Boston. He knew he wanted to be in pro music. So he just moved to LA and started working connections. And at the moment that Josh left Z, I called up Joe and said, "Now's your shot." And, and I gave Dweezil the package, and he checked out Joe playing Frank's music, and Joe became the next drummer in Z. Now Joe is the boss.
How much road were you guys touring with that group?
Very little. We weren't really touring that much, but we were rehearsing constantly. It's almost like a callback to when I was 18 years old and rehearsing for a year and doing one gig and then breaking up. We did a little more than one gig a year, but not too much. We were paid to rehearse basically. We were on retainer. We're on year-round retainer, and we would just like rehearse all the time. And then Scott Tunis left. Joe Travers brought Bryan Beller into the band, and then that became the band. Dweezil, Amit, me, Travers. And every once in a while we'd do a tour for maybe 2-3 weeks, and then we'd come back and start rehearsing again. So that band was really, really well rehearsed, and it didn't pay off on the records. We did several albums. One's called Shampoo Horn, and there's another one called Music for Pet. And Shampoo Horn's got some good energy to it, but the way to experience that band was live. There's some stuff on YouTube. But we used to do this medley, which at its peak could be almost like 40 minutes long. It was 200 songs from the 70s, and it was designed solely to just obliterate an audience. It's one of those things where you can see the stages of disbelief as it's happening. Because we start off, we're doing like some rockin' riffs. It's like they're playing some hot songs from the 70s that we like, but then it just keeps going, and the segues from song to song get more and more absurd, where
Oh my God.
the pivot point from one song to the next might be a lyric, or it might be a note in a riff, and it does not matter how it evolves in terms of the time changes or the key signature changes. All that matters is finding any way to connect one song to another song.
That's hilarious. That's
And
like
it could, as I say, it could be a word or a note. It was like digital editing, but in real life. You know, it turned into a collage. And
like
the only way to, yeah, exactly. And there's some versions of it on YouTube, but never. I don't know if there's any like of the full, like we played at a NAMM show for PV one year, and we did like a shorter a version of an edited version. And change most of the lyrics to the songs to just the word PV. so that's kind of you know, not an accurate representation. But
oh my God.
At its peak, it was 200 songs, and there was also, you know, moments of improvisation there.
You're
Where
just
Amit
like breaking
just
people's
sang.
brains in the
Yeah.
audience. It's
And
just
so,
like I can't.
yeah, exactly. So you see at first, you know, people are rocking out, and then they become dumbfounded, and then they become this disbelief, and then they might become angry, and then gradually, by the time we get to the end of the thing, there's some kind of satori achieved. You know?
Oh my God. You know, if you played like a jam band festival and people were like tripping, you'd like have like a sanitarium filled with
Yeah.
people in
Well,
some sort of acid loop.
Yeah, but it's a thing of you literally can't believe what's happening, because the only
Yeah.
way to play a medley of 200 songs where the segues are entirely bizarre, and the tempo, the key signature and the time signature is changing, you know, literally every 2 seconds. You know, it's like some crazy John Zorn composition except it's being performed live, you know, and done at massive volume levels with really, you know, loud distorted guitars and slamming drums. And Amit, who's a very uncompromising performer, just getting right in people's faces. I mean, it was an incredible thing to be a part of.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I was very, you know, very happy to stay involved in the Zappa world. So, you know, I was, you know, it's like almost 9 years when I think, because I joined Frank's band in late '87, and I left Dweezil's band in mid '96. So I was really,
Wow.
you know, in that orbit for a long time. And then, you know, when I left Dweezil, I was like, it was with the idea that I was going to focus. It's like, okay, it's time for my band now. It's Beer for Dolphins time. I had already put out a couple of solo records. I was working on another one, and I was ready to like just like throw all my energy behind that. And then Steve Vai called, and this was rough for Bryan Beller, because he took a great leap of faith, because when I left Dweezil's band, it was not under pleasant circumstances, and Dweezil had determined that anybody that was on in my camp was enemy territory. So he had put it to Bryan Beller that you either play with Keneally or you play with me. And Bryan chose me, which was very, very you know, gratifying for me. It still like moves me that he made that call, and then I repaid that leap of faith by joining Steve Vai's band a few weeks later, and tried very, very hard to get Bryan in the band as well. But Bryan didn't join Steve Vai's band for another 10 years. So he went on a different path for a while, and you know, I'm fortunate that he didn't. You know, it was not pleasant, but he understood why I did what I did. And actually, after I joined Steve's band, we had a long tour, like a 2.5 month tour, where my band Beer for Dolphins were opening. So Bryan at least got to be a part of the experience, and it just happened to be this psycho experience where, you know, at the time Steve was not very fond of taking days off, and at one point we did 17 shows in 18 days, and so I was out. I would do an opening set with Beer for Dolphins. I'd go backstage I'd get dressed and then I'd go back out and play for 2.5 hours with Steve.
Yeah. My band is like that. We did 53 shows in 52 days.
Okay, well, that's I mean, yeah.
We never have days off.
Yeah.
Never.
Hey, buddy. Hi, pal.
Oh. That's Milton.
Hi, Milton. Good boy.
Yeah.
So and our tour bus burned up on that tour. All kinds of like crazy hijinks on that road. Lots of drinking, lots of drugs, lots of sex. It was insanity. So Bryan got to be a part of that.
That's nice. At least he got something. But now Bryan is doing amazing. I mean, he's with Aristocrats and all the stuff.
Plus, I've continued to get him work because I got Dethklok, and then I got him that gig. I got Joe Satriani, and then I got him that gig. So he's got no complaints with me.
All right. Yeah, you're all right in Bryan's book.
Yeah, and it's anything else is water under the bridge at this point.
Right. So the Steve Vai thing. What was next for you after that gig?
After Vai, let's see. I was in Steve's band for I guess 5 years, 96 to 2001, and then
I don't imagine that gig is a very rowdy gig. It's like drugs, sex, rock and roll gig, but apparently it is the instrumental guitar world.
Well, I mean, Steve wasn't getting involved in the world, but other people in the
roadies
entourage
and sound engineers.
Yeah, sure.
That's what they live for.
Yeah, that stuff is available. So it was the mid '90s, and everybody was pretty young, and you're just on the road and not having days off, and you just go crazy and you act out in various ways. But and so when I got to the end of the Vai experience, and at that point I was like, okay, now I'm really going to do it. Now I was preparing this album in 2001 called Dancing, or it was 2000. That's when I left. It was 2000. And I had an 8-piece band at that point, and I really felt that I needed to put all my energy into my solo stuff. And Steve was very understanding. In fact, he was sweet enough to issue Dancing through Favored Nations. So he was supporting my efforts and being very kind. And I did my darndest to just like make my solo career be the primary thing in my life. And I had a wonderful time, and I did a lot of great shows and stuff. But I quickly discovered, the financial downside to doing that if you don't have a really, big audience that's ready to spend a lot of money on you.
Sure.
It's you know how it is. Promoters want some kind of guarantee of a return on their investment. You don't just get gigs because you know how to play.
Sure.
So
gotta sell tickets.
Yeah. So
or not.
So after 6 years of basically, I would take other gigs to pay bills, but I was like primarily just trying to make a go of it as a solo artist, and it was a struggle. So in 2007, I had become friends with this guy Brendan Small, who had created a cartoon called Home Movies that my girlfriend Sarah, who's now my wife, and I were real big fans of this show. And she said, "Hey, this was the Facebook era." She said, "Hey, Brendan is on Facebook. You should write to him and say hi," because we dug the fact that not only was Brendan really funny, he also did the music for the show, and the music was based on all this really cool guitar stuff. And it's like I could tell he was a fast guitar player. So I wrote Brendan on Facebook, and I said, "I don't know if you know who I am, but I play guitar too, and my girlfriend and I really love the show, and I just wanted to say hi." And he wrote back, "Dude, I'm a huge fan. I really like your music. In fact, when you came and did a clinic at Berkeley in 1996, I was a student. I was in the room, and man, we got to hang out." And he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm working on a new show. I'm working on this show about a metal band. I think it's going to be really stupid. You'll probably like it." And that turned out to be Metalocalypse, which turned out to be huge. Yeah. And then Metalocalypse became really popular. They put out an album of music from the show that was like hugely popular, and then Turner Broadcasting, Adult Swim is like saying you need to like get on the road and play this music. And Brendan, for all his incredible gifts, had never led a band before. Like he was a music student in Berkeley, and he had stage fright, and he started doing stand-up comedy as a means to battle his stage fright. He chose like the most terrifying thing you can do, which is do stand-up comedy. And as a result of doing that, he conquered some of his fears about performing music. But he had never led a band, so literally his first experience being the leader of the group was going out on the road, performing Dethklok songs after he'd already released a debut album that sold 100,000 copies.
That's unbelievable.
And
what a weird world.
And he's coming to terms with the fact that, and plus he's like shredding nonstop, and he's doing the lead vocals at the same time. So he's basically, my job in live Dethklok was to play his first overdub, because there's like Brian May influenced guitar harmonies all over that stuff. Plus, it's like a lot of things, there's riff-based stuff while there's shredding going on. So I'd be doing the riffs while he was soloing on top, and he could be doing like the while he's shredding. So he had to basically be like, if you're familiar with that band, there's Skwisgaar Squigzelf is the lead guitar player, and oh God, it's been so long. The lead singer, Nathan, the lead vocalist. He was basically being both of those guys at once. So he not only had to, conquer whatever performance anxieties they might have had, or just like figuring out how to be in a band. He also had to execute incredible feats of simultaneous musicianship, because he'd be playing one thing and I say singing, but most of the Dethklok songs are
growling,
in a completely arrhythmic relationship to what he's playing, and he just had to practice it over and over and over and over until it became like one reflexive gesture. Unbelievable.
Yeah, dude, I don't know. My favorite episode is that with the blues guy trying to teach him how to play slide, and it's just like, we can't play slows, and they all like harmonize. What's it, Mashed Potato Johnson?
God, it's so funny. Brennan is so
dying, dude.
He's a genuinely funny guy. He's brilliantly talented,
Yeah.
So that was super exciting. I mean, the Dethklok experience, it's just to play that stuff and do that show. Did you ever get to see any of those shows?
No, I just saw this from the cartoon, man.
The show was incredible because we had an hour-long, set thing that we were doing, that we were accompanying a video. There was a huge screen, and there was special animation that was done just for the tour. So every song had like an animated video that went along with it. And then in between some of the songs, there would be like little comedy sketches, and the band would go off stage and get a drink of water or just chill out for a minute while this comedy sketch would play out, and then we would come back on and do the next song. And it was it was just pow 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 pow. It was like a really aggressive multimedia extravaganza, and the audience would just lose it. The audience would lose their minds, and that was my first experience playing for a lot of people that were just like beating the shit out of each other, and it was very exciting. The energy was great.
I can't even imagine
it. Because that's when I realized that ideally the energy in a mosh pit is a very giving and understanding and generous one, if it's being done correctly. And I subsequently found out, because that was like my immersion in the metal scene. I was never playing any metal. So when I all of a sudden Brennan asked me to join Dethklok, and I'm like, dude, I'm not a metal player. And he goes, you play Zappa, you can play anything. And so he put it to me as almost like a challenge.
Yeah, and you're like, I am a metal player, I guess.
Yeah, it's like, well, I guess you're right. If because there are aspects, but it's still different. It's one thing to learn, some insane melody of Frank's that requires a bunch of weird intervallic leaps. And it's an entirely different thing to develop the specific muscle groups required to go relentlessly. and then or to do sweeping, arpeggios
Right.
and stuff like that. I had never gone there. I didn't care to go there. But once I did go there at Brendan's behest, I realized, oh damn it, this is fun. And then to play with Gene Hoglan on drums is just like, the only metaphor I can use is it's like strapping yourself to a locomotive and just going along. So exciting. And then to have the audience just like waves of humanity. Yeah,
I can't even imagine the experience.
So
it's a lot of power. It's a lot of power.
A lot of power, and the peak of it was 10 years ago now when we went on the road with Mastodon and they were touring Crack the Sky, and that we would do our thing, and then Mastodon would come out and play all of Crack the Sky, and that was heaven, man. That was just heaven. I love that.
Destroy, huh?
I love that tour.
Yeah.
And then while Dethklok was still going on, Joe Satriani called, and
just out of the blue.
Yeah, well, he had actually called me in 2005 to ask if I wanted to join his band then, and I had a back injury, and I couldn't tour. I was like, I could barely move at that, and I was like thinking about the realities of touring, hoisting myself into a bus bunk and all that. And I was like, I just don't think I can. In fact, it just wasn't the time. So, but then I was at the same time I'm thinking this is a little weird to turn down Joe Satriani. I hope it's not my last chance. And then, he called me back in 2010 and offered me again. But this time, like the first time he called, he wanted me as a rhythm guitar player. The second time he called, he wanted me as a keyboardist. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I liked how absurd it would be to simultaneously be a guitar player in Dethklok and a keyboardist in Joe Satriani's band. And everything about it was just appealing to me. But he just said it was interesting. He said, I really want a keyboard player in the band, but I don't want, I was thinking about all the keyboard players I know. I know a lot of great keyboardists, and then I suddenly thought of you, and I realized, wait a second, what I really want is a keyboardist who plays guitar, who understands how a guitar player thinks, and knows basically how to stay out of the
what people want to play on.
Yeah, exactly. What a guitar player wants to play over. And if you're a keyboardist who's like, cramming every possible space with substitutions and stuff, that you can take up a lot of space.
It's a huge drag.
Yeah. And Joe is a rocker. He wants textures that excite him. So I said, yeah, I can do that. I know how to play an open fifth on a keyboard.
Sure.
So I ended up adapting a lot of rhythm guitar parts for keys, and then I hit it off with him. It's like we had so much fun. And then after 3 years in the band, he said finally, you know what? I think we should get you on guitar for some stuff. And it's like maybe 3 tunes out of the night you play guitar. I was like, oh, that's cool. So I got my guitar rig going and I started playing with him. And then as we started liking it, it just started getting more and more and more.
Yeah.
To the point where it's like half the show I'm on guitar, more than half the show. So, now when I play with Satriani, it's pretty much exactly evenly divided between guitar and keyboard. But I'm usually doing both at the same time. But there are towards the later years, it got more and more improvisational, where he really wanted me to come out and join him at the front of the stage on several songs, and we would just play together for a long time. It's like Joe tends to lose track of time at moments like that, and I'm always thinking he's going to wind up a second now, and he doesn't. He just keeps going and going and going. He's not concerned about curfews, that's for sure.
Man.
So improvising next to Satriani is obviously a very inspiring thing that keeps me on my toes.
So, dude, what a story you have, though. I mean, it's like, first of all, it's an amazing career, and like so many cool things happen. But like to me, like the way you got started, like the.
Ultimately, it started because I chose to call Frank's office, and
the big lesson is like, you probably inside were like shaking, and like it was like very nerve-wracking, but like the balls, like it's just to do that thing.
In my recollection, it was less about shaking and more just like bemused, like, well, this isn't going anywhere. He doesn't know who I am. This can't possibly work. But I'm going to try anyway, because what's there to lose? There's nothing to lose. So, I actually remember a sense of being kind of calm when I made the call,
Because you thought it wouldn't amount?
Yeah, I thought, well, there's nothing at stake.
Right.
And there wasn't. I wasn't going to lose anything.
But so many people that have nothing to lose will never make the move, out of an irrational fear.
Right? I guess. That's absolutely true. So yeah, nothing to lose and everything possible to gain. And so I think, I'll take this shot, and I'm so glad I did.
Well, the story with you and with Beller with you is like, if you really like somebody, learn their music. That speaks volumes.
Exactly. Yeah, and Bryan had to contend with the weird energy I was giving him, but it gradually paid off for him as well. And like for me, when I was growing up, teaching myself how to play Black Page because I thought it was fun and challenging, I wasn't consciously doing job prep, but it turns out that that's what I was doing, and now to once again be playing that music, and I'm realizing again that because I've tried to be pretty selective with Zappa related projects over the years, like I haven't been joining tribute bands and spending a lot of time doing the unofficial Zappa stuff. When I do, I like doing stuff with like really unusual arrangements or with orchestras, something like. Or there's this guy in New York named Ed Palermo who writes beautiful arrangements. So I've done some shows with him just because I respect his musicianship so much. And there's another guy, a conductor named Christian Yarvi, who I did a series of shows called Absolute Zappa because he did beautiful orchestral arrangements, and I'm like, that stuff excites me. But I haven't done it that much, Zappa shows. So to now be on this tour and remember how it feels to play Frank's music, and especially to be playing it with Scott Tunis and Robert Martin and Ed Mann, who I toured with in '88. So to reconnect with them and kind of find some kind of resolution to what was a very unresolved situation back in 1988, because that band did not end smoothly. It just stopped. And so to reconnect with them and be able to play this music and be a part of this insane show, it reminds me of how exciting it is. And I also realize when I'm soloing on this stuff, no other music, including my own, gets to me the way Frank's does. It brings something out of me that is really, really deep inside me.
Yeah.
And people have been expressing to me that they can feel it. I feel like I'm growing musically as a result of this tour, and it's bringing stuff out of me and in my playing that is going to that I'm really glad at this stage of my life and my career that I can still find resources of stuff that inside me that I didn't know was there.
That's amazing.
I'm very, very, very grateful for this experience right now. And then I'm also equally grateful to be a part of Devin Townsend's world right now, because I co-produced his new record, which is called Empath. Have you heard this record yet?
No.
Have you heard much Devin Townsend?
No, not much.
He's an amazing creator, a brilliant vocalist, brilliant guitar player, fantastic writer, and just his musical concepts are very evolved. and he asked me to co-produce this record with him, and I'm as happy about being a part of this project as I am about anything that I've ever done.
Wow.
I'm so grateful, and
that's next on my listening list for sure.
Yeah,
that's a good place to start with that music.
I think that he's done a lot. He was the singer in Steve Vai's band when Steve did the album Sex and Religion, and he was a polarizing figure because he came out of nowhere. He was 19 years old. He had this kind of very aggressive, raging punk energy. People wanted to discount him, but then he would go up, stand next to Steve, and play everything that Steve was playing. It's just like shredding insanely on the guitar. He's an incredible guitar. But then he has this insanely powerful voice, and then he can sing anything. There's some really good videos online of vocal coaches hearing Devin Townsend for the first time and their reaction to him, and they're like, "God, this guy can really sing," because a lot of guys and a lot of singers in rock. I'm sorry, I keep using the sexist term "guys." A lot of singers in rock don't necessarily have the mechanics of vocalizing together to the degree that Devin does. He's just this, like, his instrument is outrageous, and
he's on.
and the way he uses it. So yeah, all I can say is check out Empath by Devin Townsend.
Empath. Next on my listening list for sure.
Yeah,
Today.
and to give yourself some time, if possible, to experience the whole journey from start to finish, because it really is a journey from start to finish. Steve Vai is on it also. The last guitar solo on the final song is Steve Vai. It's beautiful. So
wow,
yeah, check it out.
Dude. Well, Mike Keneally, thank you so much for your time. You're more than kind, and you're a legend. And everybody is going to check out your bands, your projects, the stuff you're producing, your music. What's the best way to find you online? Where do you direct people?
Keneally.com, which is not always. I don't always keep it updated, but it's a good resource of stuff. And you can, if people are interested in buying my music, they can connect from there to the Keneally store, where all my stuff is. And,
everybody, please buy some stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I've got over 30 albums that I've done in the last 27 years, so there's lots to choose from. And the most recent album is called Scambot 2, and I'm very, very pleased with that record. So I'm happy to use that as if people are curious about my stuff, maybe start there
and work your way backwards. That's amazing. Mike, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Talk to you.
Bye-bye. Bye.